Hey, welcome. It's 5 Minutes with KeRusso, and it's a Monday video, and we're walking through this letter of Philippians, trying to understand the message that God has for us today. Part of being able to do that is going to require us to know the historical background to this letter. Now, you can begin that quest by going to Acts chapter 16 and read about Paul and Silas when they first went to Philippi, the things that happened to them there, the people they met, and you'll get a chance to meet some of those first disciples in that ancient church. But another way to do that is to look in the letter itself, and I'm going to take some time with you in this segment and in the next segment to show you that. What we're looking for today are specific references, historical references that are contained within this letter so that you can see what was going on with Paul, what was going on with the readers. Now, I'm going to read for you as quickly as I can all the things that I've found, and I'll tell you where I found them at, so you might want a notepad and a pen where you can write it down. You may have already begun that, so we can compare what I found with what you found. Here's what I found. Chapter 1, verse 1, Paul wrote the letter. Timothy was with him. He wrote the letter to the church in Philippi, a church that had elders and deacons. In chapter 1, verse 12 through 13, Paul is in prison. In verse 14 of that chapter, Paul's example of proclaiming the gospel, even while in prison, inspired other disciples to be bold and proclaim the gospel without fear. In verse 15 and 17, there were others who were proclaiming the gospel for selfish reasons, even trying to make things worse for Paul while he was in prison. And in verse 20 of chapter 1, Paul did not know if his imprisonment would result in freedom or an execution. And verse 29 of that chapter, the Philippian disciples were struggling and they were suffering as well. In chapter 2, verse 12, Paul is separated from the disciples in Philippi. That we kind of figured that already. In verse 15, Paul wanted to send Timothy to them so that he could encourage them. And verse 20 through 23, Timothy had shown he did not look out for his own interest. In chapter 2, verse 25 through 30, Paul was ready. He was sending back Epaphroditus, a brother the disciples in Philippi had sent to Paul to help him in his imprisonment. And he had reason for, he had recovered from some life-threatening illness. In chapter 3 and verse 1, Paul had previously encouraged them to find joy in the Lord by writing them something else. In chapter 3, verse 4 through 11, Paul had given up much standing of his own so that he could suffer for Jesus. And if you look in chapter 3, verse 12 through 14, Paul continued to strive for his reward in Jesus. In chapter 3 and verse 18, there were many enemies of the cross around them. Their minds were on earthly things, and they would end up being destroyed. In chapter 4 and verse 10 through 19, the Philippians had a history of helping Paul and had renewed their efforts through Epaphroditus to help him. Now, those are specific statements in the letter of Philippians that I found that speak to the historical nature of what was going on in Paul's life at the time of his writing the letter and in the life of those Philippian disciples. You need to know that. It helps you understand what's going on and why Paul's writing this letter. It also is going to give you a foundation to understand the next part of what we're going to look at. And what I want you to do is over the next week, read through Philippians and look at major exhortations, commands, or encouragements that Paul gives to those disciples. That also is going to give you some understanding of what's happening historically in that community and that church to those disciples, so that you can read these verses in this letter in its context. Sometimes we take these verses that we read in a book like Philippians, a letter like Philippians, and we apply it to our lives without taking into any consideration the historical context of why they were even written. And when we do that, we'll pull those verses out of context, not not willingly, not knowingly. We're not trying to do something wrong, but we end up doing something wrong, and we misunderstand the verse and misapply it because we never understood the context, the historical context. So this is important for you to be able to do this. And I hope you will take this journey with me. There's a lot of things you can discover if you will make sure you know the historical context of this letter. All right, thanks a lot. And I'll see you next time as we look at Philippians. Be blessed. Leave any comments on this page. Send an email at booksbykerusso@gmail.com. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.